Okay, this week we are going to look at the history of slavery in the Roman Republic. And you can see I've subtitled this, The Downfall of the Republic Continued. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about some things that were happening in terms of expansion and how this is bringing in massive amounts of wealth. And at least according to Roman historians, this is really the beginning of the downfall of the Republic. So let's start talking about slavery. Okay, as we already know, Roman Republican society was certainly a slave-owning society. There's lots of debate about the actual numbers of slaves that were owned in the Roman Republic, and I put a few numbers here. They might have made up 20 to 30% of the total population, and if you look at some of the literature that's coming out in terms of population numbers in rural areas, you got about 70%. And if you think about it, that really means that if this number is true, most of them are working on agriculture. And no big surprise, most of the labor that they're doing really benefits the wealthy, because if you remember, we talked about the creation of the latifundia, which was the large agricultural estates that were set up by the wealthy. These were pretty much worked by slaves. Now, you don't have all of the slaves in the Roman Republic doing just agricultural work. So primarily what we're talking about here is the type of slave, depending on who the owner is. That's really what I want to say here. So sometimes you can have slaves, and I've listed a few jobs here, administrators of these latifundias or other business dealings. They can act as financial agents for their owner. They can be secretaries, and no big surprise, the more slaves you owned, usually the higher status you were, because it showed that you had wealth. Now I've given you here social order in the 1st century BC. I just want you to be aware that in the time period we're still talking about, there is no emperor. So that doesn't start till about 30 BC. So anyway, just be aware of that. So you've got the consul sitting at the top, the senators, equestrians, the judges, then you've got the free people, and then of course the slaves sit at the very bottom. We'll talk about what freed slave citizens are, and of course we're talking about slavery right now. Here's a little quote from a Roman poet named Martial. What I'd like you to do is to stop the video and then read it and really think about what it's telling us about the conditions of a slave during this particular period. So pretty clear that slaves are beaten. We'll look at this a little bit more. And again, Martial is a poet. It's sometimes hard to tell if he's talking about real life or not, but we know from other Roman sources that this is certainly the case for many of the slaves during the Roman Republic. And we've talked a little bit about this, and you've been reading articles on this. Where do these slaves come from? So most of them, by the time you get down to the late Republic, are really slaves that are being born to slaves, which is the second category. Slave parents had slave children. You also get slaves being captured in war. And by the time you get down to the Republic, you still have expansion going on, but not as much as normal. So when the Romans were expanding, they were capturing people. What they tended to do was they'd considered to be booty, so the soldiers could grab people and then sell them off. And you had to, when you send off the slaves, when you go to an auction, they had to actually say where these slaves were coming from. Okay, I've got a few slides here on the legality of a slave. And as you can see here, pretty horrible life. They were really considered to be things and not people. They're human property, and as you can see from this third box, they could be bought, sold, mortgaged, given away, bequeathed in a will, and lots of other things. So really what we're talking about here is they are really just property. When you think about the life of a slave, if you get down to sort of the day-to-day existence, it was a pretty horrible life for these people. So slave families did not have to be recognized. There could be marriage, but the marriage was only done or only approved of by the owner. So if the owner did not approve of a marriage, then there was no marriage. And even if the people did get married, they could be broken up because, again, they're property. So the husband might be sent to another area, leaving the wife behind. And then we've already sort of mentioned this before. Any children born to slave women were instantly the property of the owner. Um, no big surprise, the owner controlled everything about the life of this owner. And I've given you a little quote here by a Roman named Gaius in his Institutes. Quote, "Whatever is acquired through the slave is acquired for the master." In terms of things that could be done to the slaves, they could be beaten, they could be killed. Usually they're not killed by their owner because, again, you have to think about them as being a piece of property. It costs the owner something to get them, and it costs them to feed them and so on, so you don't really want to kill them. There are lots of examples of slaves, especially women, being sexually abused by their owner, and this seems to be pretty common in the Republic and later in the Empire. I also put here, they could give testimony in court, but as you can see here, it was only under torture. So that was the only way that they could be part of a court proceeding. Okay, now what could they do? So it really depends on who the owner is. So if you've got a wealthy owner, he could put a slave in charge of his entire business, and then the slave would essentially be acting as the owner. So you can have a slave making legally binding contracts. If a property need to be sold, the slave administrator could sign all of the paperwork in the name of the owner. You could have, in some cases, especially where the slave is owned by a wealthy person, that person could own property. And I've given you the Latin word here, peculium. And then with that, we also know that if the slave business, or the business owned by the slave makes enough money, we know that the slave could actually own his own slaves. Okay, and if you want to read more about slavery from the point of view of a Roman, I've given you here some areas that you can go to. So Livy's, I've given you two quotes here from Livy, 41.28.9 and 45.34.5, where he talks a little bit about what's going on. And then you've got a book by a man named Cato the Elder, who wrote something called On Agriculture. He also talks about slaves, but of course this is by no means the only list that we have. Here is an image of some slaves that were being captured in war, and let me see if I can write on this. So what we're looking at are this figure here and this figure here being captured. So these people would be captured and then sold at an auction more than likely. Now, if you look at the caption here that I've given, this is from 20 AD, which is a little bit later than our time period, but we know that this was going on during the Republican period. Here's another image of slave markets. So what you have here are a line of people that were about to be auctioned off. We know in Rome there were two places where you could buy slaves that were in the Roman Forum itself. So you would just go if you had some money and then buy one of these people. Here's an image of some of the fetters. So you've got leg chains, you've got a neck chain. And then what's really interesting, and we've talked about this before, so most of our information is really about the wealthy people because it's the wealthy people that are writing. Now, archaeology can sometimes give us a little more information. This is a villa from an Italian town called Gregnano. This is south of Naples, and in these villas, this one in particular is number 34, you've got some slave quarters. And I don't know if you can actually read the bottom here, but these are the rooms that were fairly certain that the slaves were kept in. And if you look at the legend down at the bottom, you can see that animals were kept in here, other people lived in here. But this is a really important archaeological find because it gives us a sort of a physical view of what the slaves went through in terms of where they were staying. Okay, so you do have many examples of slaves being freed, and these are called freedmen. Um, if you know anything about the history of slavery in the United States, slaves could be manumitted, or the noun manumission. That is a Latin word, and it means to be sent away. Really, what it is freeing a slave. As I put here, common. So freed slaves could be citizens. Now, there's a lot of debate about this. Usually what happens is freedmen are not technically citizens, so their children certainly would be. And it just really depends on who the owner is. If the owner is very wealthy, it could all work out. So what you have are freed slaves. A freedman could buy property, write a will, contracts, and as I put here again, I just mentioned this, children could be freed. Now, you're not necessarily absolutely freed from your former owner, because what tends to happen is that your former owner will become your patron, or the person who will help you out in your life now as a free person. And as I put here, according to sort of the Roman thought on this, freeing was an act of kindness, and then it was expected that you show your gratitude to your former owner, and this is what the patron setup really is. Now, despite the fact of a freedman being a free person, there were still rules and regulations on how you would be reacting to people who were born free. And really, this slide here is really referring to the actions that were happening between the freedmen and their former owners. So you couldn't be verbally aggressive with your former owner. You couldn't reproach them. If you acted in a really bad way, you could lose your freedom again, or freedom that you have, and then become a slave again. And what's really interesting too, part of this gratitude that you would have to show if you were a freedman to your owner is that usually the labor of the freedman would be owned by the patron, meaning you would be financially tied to your patron. Now, being a freedman, you could sue, but judges rarely allow this to happen, or rarely allowed a suit to go through, because it would be embarrassing for the former owner. And then finally, when you think about laws regarding what the freedmen can do, they could never be senators, you couldn't marry into families, you could not enter the equestrian order, you could not be part of the military, and if you committed a crime, you could receive harsher penalties than what would happen if you were born free. And the last thing I want to say in this particular lecture is, again, if freedmen have children, those children are considered to be absolutely free and citizens of the Roman Republic.